What's up, everybody? I'm Billy with SpecTrain. Welcome back to the channel. Really excited to be bringing you today a video on movement. Now, I think when this comes out, the last video that we posted on the channel was all about shooting on the move. This is not going to be that. This is going to be kind of entries and exits in and out of positions, specifically what we would call hard entries and exits. So soft entries would be a situation where you can kind of shoot your way into a position. A hard exit or an entry would be, for whatever reason, you've got to shoot some stuff from right here, and then when you're done shooting, you can leave and go over there and shoot some more stuff, right? So kind of efficiently entering and exiting positions so that when you're done shooting, you can immediately be covering ground, and then once you arrive at your next position, you can immediately be shooting, looking for just overall efficiency and trying to accomplish what we need to accomplish as fast as possible. Now, the tools we're going to be explaining today, I'm going to really explain in the context of practical shooting. This stuff works or has applications for, depending on context, obviously defensive or tactical use as well. But we're not really going to take time to be playing out scenarios and explain where to plug these tools in. We're just going to be talking about the most efficient ways to do things. Hopefully those will be tools in your toolbox that I'll leave it up to you guys to pull it out when it's appropriate based on context and what you guys do, right? We're going to start very, very simply, because if I give you too much to think about at once, I find it to be really, really difficult for folks to obviously work on a bunch of different things at the same time. So we're going to start simply with kind of the main concepts of efficient movement, and then we're going to add some really granular, more advanced layers. This is kind of a sneak peek of the way we teach this block in both our performance mechanics and our level up pistol courses, where we look at some of this kind of movement. And so I'll be just kind of giving you a sneak peek of what we do in those courses. But with that said, let's dive in. The first thing we're going to talk about on our entries and exits are kind of the main issues that we see that folks naturally have. On our entries, right, here's the kind of context. I'm moving from the barrel stack over here on the left to this barrel stack. I've got a target down range, I believe you can see in frame, maybe just barely, that I'm going to be engaging around the right side of this barrel. What a lot of folks will do, and of course I'll exaggerate this a little bit just so it's clear to everybody, but what a lot of folks will do is run to the position, right? And then once I arrive here, present the gun up on target. This is just a massive chunk of time that we're leaving on the table, and it's a really inefficient way to do it, because now whatever the time is from when the target's available to when I actually see my sights is a chunk of time when no movement and no shooting's happening. We're just burning that time. What I would like to do is be ready to shoot as soon as the target is available. And so the main thing I'm gonna have you guys start working on right off the bat is making sure that the gun is up early enough coming into position. Think about how much more time I would save if I'm actually seeing my sights, so that as soon as I come around the edge of this barrel, I'm just ready to break that shot immediately into the A zone as soon as the target appears. You're probably saving at least half to 3/4 of a second on every single entry like that over folks that aren't doing that. Now, for folks that have been doing maybe shooting in this kind of a context for a while, where you've been training performance movement, but not at a super granular level, what a lot of folks try to do subconsciously is essentially what they want to do is see their sights and the target at the same time. As they come around the edge of the vision barrier, they're trying to drive out the gun. Maybe they'll even kind of have it a little bit below eye level early, and then as they see the target, they're presenting the gun, or they're trying to time it to where they see them both at the exact same time. The problem is that if you measure times in a small enough chunk, there is no such thing as seeing your sights and the target at the exact same time. You're either going to be seeing your sights before the target's available, or you are seeing them after. Obviously, if you're seeing them after, that's burning time. So I would rather intentionally see my sights a little bit early, not only so that I can be ready to shoot as soon as possible, but also so that I can actually be doing a little bit of that aiming before I'm even required to be shooting. Think about for a second, if I didn't have a opaque vision barrier like this where I can't see through it, if I was just using this wall, right, where this had this kind of mesh and I've got to get past the edge of this wall to shoot, what I could literally be doing as I come into position is be seeing my dot in the center of the A zone until that wall just slides out of the way, and boom, I can just watch my sights lift right in the center of the A zone, and I'm just waiting for that wall to slide out of the way, right? With something like a barrel or a wall in your house or any kind of opaque vision barrier like this, what I'm going to be doing, presuming that I know where the target is already like we do in practical shooting, is I'm going to be presenting the gun, need some Go Fast juice, presenting the gun to where I see the target to be through the barrel. Ideally, as I come into this position, if I have the opportunity to catch that target in my vision and know exactly where it is, that's obviously ideal, because now I can present the gun exactly to that spot. And again, I'm just waiting for that barrel to slide out of the way so that I can land that first shot. Now, the way to make sure you're doing this correctly is I want you guys to actually be seeing your dot on this barrel or on your wall before you can see the target. What a lot of guys do when I don't make sure you're focusing on that point is, again, they just kind of have the gun just a little bit below, and then when they see the target, they're lifting it up on target. That's not the idea. I want you actually looking through the optic at where you perceive the target to be, just waiting for it to appear around the edge of that vision barrier. Now, sometimes when I explain it that way, as far as seeing your dot on the barrel, what guys do is they pick a spot on the barrel and they aim at it. What this ends up looking like is almost like you're pieing the corner, right? So as I come into position, you'll see him aim at the barrel. Keep in mind my target's over here, but I'm aiming at the barrel and I sort of wrap around the barrel to where the target is. That's not what I'm asking you to do. I'm asking you to aim at where you perceive the target to be. You just can't see it through the barrel, and therefore your dot will appear momentarily on the barrel itself, right? So as I come into position, I'm literally just catching the target, aiming at it, waiting for it to appear, and letting that shot go off as soon as the target appears behind the barrel. Now, in the event that you don't know exactly where the target is, either because maybe this is a whole opaque wall you can't see, or you just simply didn't catch it in time before you came into this position, you may have to fix the sights a little bit after the target appears behind the barrel, obviously. But still, I would much rather be adjusting a little bit through my optic versus coming up and having to do all of that every single time. And if you get lucky and the dot happens to appear right in the middle of the A zone, then of course you can just send it, right? So the main thing we're gonna focus on coming into our entries to start with is making sure we're seeing our sights slightly before either the target's available, or if we're just setting, a fault line or something we have to cross, I'm seeing the sights before I'm in position and allowed to shoot, so that as soon as I am in position, I can be shooting immediately. Hopefully that makes sense. The second piece that I'll just quickly mention is that I want to arrive soft enough that I can actually use those sights, right? If I'm crashing into position super aggressively and I'm carrying in a lot of momentum and I'm kind of having to chop, again exaggerating there, but you guys get the idea, chop my feet into position, then obviously it's gonna, my sight, even if I'm seeing my sights are going like this, and I can't really use them. So I actually want to brake hard enough before I reach this position that I can sort of just coast in that last little step or two and be ready to shoot immediately. Let's talk about our exits as well. Just for the sake of the camera and the fact that I'm out here filming myself, I won't go all the way down there. I'll just imagine this is my shooting position and I'm now leaving going this way. What we see happen for a lot of folks is they're standing here behind the barrel, and when they get ready to leave, their first move is something like this, right? Now, you just noticed I had to do two things. I had, number one, drop my center of gravity, and then if you watch the left foot, my first step is actually opposite the direction that I want to go. Now, when I show this to folks, a lot of times you're like, no, nobody actually does that. Yes, you do that, almost certainly. And a lot of folks, when you start going back and watching footage of yourself doing shooting exercises like this, will realize that you in fact have a habit of doing this out of every single position, whether you need to or not. Here's where this comes from, in my opinion. If I get in my position and I'm using a shooting stance, something like this, this is a lot like what a lot of folks are taught. I've got my feet roughly shoulder width apart. I've got one foot dropped a little bit to the rear, and my legs are basically straight. I'm stood up nice and tall. This is a perfectly okay shooting stance for stand and deliver shooting. However, I'm really not ready to move in a lateral manner explosively from here. There's two reasons for that. Number one, with my legs actually straight, there's no power there. If you think about your leg like a spring or like a hydraulic piston, the explosive energy comes when that spring is compressed. Now you can actually have energy there. But when it's locked out, there's not a whole lot that you can do. So number one, probably having my knees bent prepares me to actually have some energy out of those legs. Now, even with that though, if I adopt this stance and I simply bend my legs are essentially straight up and down. So if I do explosively extend these legs right now, all I'm really gonna do is jump straight up because that's how my legs are oriented. So what I probably also wanna do is not only bend the knees, but get a little bit wider in my stance. Now I'm changing the angles of those legs, and specifically the shins, out to wider angles, so that if I need to explode in one direction or another, I can do that, right? So from here, now if I wanna leave, as soon as my sights leave, I can just immediately push off in the direction that I wanna go. Now, a lot of folks aren't super comfortable doing a lot of shooting in that kind of low knees bent stance. I think primarily that's an issue because that's not how we shoot normally, right? If you spend all your time practicing at the range, doing your stand and deliver, gun handling, dry fire, whatever it is, in this nice tall stood up stance, that's gonna be how you're accustomed to shooting. And so if you want to learn how to actually be efficient with practical shooting movement, you should probably adopt a wider knees bent stance just to all of your shooting, and you'll get more comfortable with it. Unless, right, you're one of the folks, and I do see this occasionally in classes, where frankly the leg strength is just not there to actually allow you to stand in this kind of a stance for very long. In which case, there's this thing called the gym you should probably check out that will help you with that quite a bit. But regardless, this is going to be really helpful for avoiding those drop steps, right? Those steps where you're up tall and you've got to lower your center of gravity and push that foot off to give you the power to step out of position. So what we're really looking for to start with in our exits is very simply lining up, and as soon as our sights lift for the last shot off that last target of the array, I'm immediately covering ground, and then I'm having my sights up soon enough as I come into position where as soon as I see the target around the edge of the barrel, I'm ready to shoot. I've got a very, very simple array set up for this. I've got one target I can shoot around the left side of the barrel. I've got another target that I'm gonna shoot when I arrive here. I'll give you a quick demo about the style of training I recommend doing when you first start working on this skill. That's pretty much it, guys. Just again, trying to cover ground as soon as I leave the first position, trying to be ready to shoot as soon as that target appears in the window. Now you'll notice what we didn't talk about at all is kind of the middle section, right? What we call the traverse. We talked about the exit, we talked about the entry, we didn't talk about the middle at all, which is surprising to folks because a lot of folks think that when you want to get really good at efficient movement, that the primary place you're going to make up time is in the sprint, if you will, in that long stretch. I would submit to you that for what we do in practical shooting, nothing could really be further from the truth. There's lots of ways to illustrate this. One of them is that frankly, we have some folks obviously in our sport at the highest level that are very unathletic, and yet their movement times, if you watch them versus extremely athletic shooters, are very, very, very similar. The super athletic guys might beat them by like a step or two, but the difference really isn't there. And I think the reason for that is simple. Usually in practical shooting, we're not doing a 40 or even 100-yard dash where your athleticism is going to account for a whole lot, right? What we're doing is, this is a long movement on a stage. You know, 3, 4, 5 step little quick movements are way more standard fare in things like USPSA and practical shooting in general. So for those, what matters so much more than your peak speed that you're able to reach is, again, covering ground immediately as soon as your sights lift and then being ready to shoot as soon as you arrive in position. Please go work out, enjoy fitness, all that's great, but it's not gonna be the biggest game changer or the lowest hanging fruit where you can immediately start making up time in your practical shooting movement. This is also, I'll rant for just a second before we get to the juicy stuff, why I have an issue with the big push in practical shooting to be training movement like without a gun and bringing over movement exercises, say from like college athletics, and trying to apply those on a stage. Again, if you're doing that for fitness and health and all that, that's super cool. Also, if you're at like the top of the sport and you're looking for every single 100th of improvement, might you gain something from that? Yes. But you got to remember, on a course of fire like this, the kind of movement that we're doing is so far removed from simply getting from point A to point B fast, right? Like in some kind of track and field sport, that it's almost unrelated, right? We're really not caring so much about the athleticism. We're caring way more about efficiency And on our exit has to look like, hey, I'm set up in a very specific way that allows me to be fast and accurate on the shooting. And then as soon as the sights lift, I can leave immediately. I don't have time to get down in a 3-point stance or anything like that, right? I've got to leave from this particular stance. And then my entry into position is not about reaching the finish line as fast as possible. It's about being ready to shoot as soon as possible. So yes, do athletic movement drills in your training, but absolutely do them with a gun and make sure that whatever you're doing in terms of movement techniques is not sacrificing your points or your ability to shoot quickly or sooner, as the case may be. So hopefully that makes sense. Now, I really highly encourage you, if this is kind of new to you, this is kind of new concepts, maybe pause the video right here and go train on this stuff for a while, because we're going to get really granular with some kind of advanced footwork and ideas that I think will be helpful to the higher level shooters. But if you're thinking about super specific footwork too early, it's just your limited bandwidth in what you can think about, right? And so this is not going to be the low hanging fruit. This is going to be when you're trying to shave off those last few tenths and hundredths in your movement when we get to kind of specific granular footwork. So start with just very basic movement in and out of position like we're doing here. And then when you're ready for it, let's get into some of the spicy stuff. All right, guys, so we spun the camera around. Now we're gonna get into some of the super granular stuff in terms of specific footwork and specific things to think about in terms of entries and exits to shave off those last little bits of time. Before I dive in, I really do want to give some credit where credit's due. I've been exploring this stuff for about the past 4 years or so, since JJ Ricazza really put me on the path of thinking about movement in a whole new way. And JJ has really done a lot to revolutionize, I think, our understanding of movement in the shooting sports, and came up with a lot of these concepts, or at least applied them from other athletics appropriately into shooting. And since then, I've learned, a lot from other guys as well, guys like Eric Raffel, Ben Steger, different world-class guys in the shooting sports have taught me a lot. A lot of the terminology I'm going to use today, I do borrow directly from JJ. I'm a huge fan, guys, of instructors not trying to invent all their own terminology and phrases for techniques they didn't come up with, right? A lot of these movement concepts are not going to be things that I invented or things that we're all doing, at least the high-level shooters are doing in the shooting sports. And so I think if we all can just learn to kind of agree upon a codified dictionary, if you will, of terminology for what we're doing, it helps shooters that train with different people and have different backgrounds and so on and so forth be able to actually have conversations and know what we're talking about, right? Versus everybody having kind of their own unique terminology for things. And so I'll use some of JJ's terminology. Please don't think that any of this is going to be an exact copy and paste of what you're going to get from any of those other guys. We all, I think, apply it and do things a little bit differently. But at the same time, there's only so many ways to skin a cat. And so I think that, a lot of this is going to be very similar to things that you would hear in some of those kind of classes. So I absolutely do want to give credit where credit's due in that regard. The first thing we're going to look at is kind of an entry, and we're going to do this what I call on kind of easy mode in terms of training. So we're defining now the position we have to get to by this box. And now I'm going to show you how these ideas translate over to vision barriers in a minute. For now, we'll start on this box. And for folks that may not be familiar with practical shooting rules, the way we would define the earliest possible moment that I can take a shot is whenever my last foot leaves the ground outside the shooting area. And so, of course, my goal is to be shooting as soon as possible, and presuming that I'm coming into this position on an aggressive enough target where I can shoot without, being perfectly still and stable, then I would probably want to be shooting as soon as that last foot leaves the shooting area. So in class, what I always do is ask folks, well, let's say I'm coming in from this side of the box, I'm entering into this position. What foot do you think I should enter into the shooting area with first? And typically, and this was me as well, guys, I'll be completely honest, when I first started doing this, my gut instinct was to try to enter the shooting area left foot first and come in like this. And again, I go, well, let's back up before we start just throwing out ideas. How should we even figure out what the proper way to enter this is? And again, we have to remember the goal, which is shooting as soon as possible. And the method that I like to look at for entries is something that I call reverse planning, right? I always ask guys hey man, how'd you figure out what time to set your alarm this morning? You knew class was this time, 8 o'clock. You wanted to get here by 7:30, so you have time to load mags and stuff. You knew it takes 20 minutes to get here, but you also want to stop at the gas station, you should add 10 minutes from that, right? You start at your end state and you work your way back, and now you know how you want to come into the day, i.e. start your alarm. So when I come in here, if I think about where I want to end up, I think about the fact that my gun's going to be out on target, And I want to take that shot as soon as my last step leaves the ground. If I come in left foot first, then I'm going to be leaving the ground sort of like this, right? And I'm trying to take a shot in kind of that stance. Versus if I come in right foot first, right? The foot that's going to be leaving the ground outside the shooting area is the left foot. So now I'm taking a shot with this kind of orientation. Which one looks more natural and which one sets me up for success more? Probably the one that actually gets my natural point of aim oriented on target as soon as possible, right? And so this is what JJ would call a 3-step entry. And the 3 steps of the entry are what he would call essentially the stomp step. And this to me is the if there's one piece of like magic secret sauce in this whole concept of the entry, it's this step right here. This is your entire index. When I'm coming in here, I'm not looking at where I want to end up. I'm looking at where I want this stomp spot to happen. So in other words, as I come in, I'm basically full send in my direction of travel. And then as my foot comes into this, this is going to be a pivot, right? Where I'm landing sort of with that heel, turning the toe down range. And this is where that gun is coming up on target. Coming in low in my stance, reaching wide into the shooting area. And that last step, obviously I'm not carrying momentum right now, so it's a little more awkward. But that last step is going to be just kind of coasting that left foot into the shooting area and landing in the shooting stance that I want. Again, none of that's going to happen if we don't pay a whole lot of attention to where we want that stomp spot to happen. It's crucial that when I leave my last shooting spot area, I know where I want that stomp to happen, and that's where my eyes go as I come in. Additionally, to clarify this process a little bit, for me, what I try to do, and by the way, I am not perfect at all this. If you watch my match footage, you're not going to see me always executing on this perfectly. But what I want to do is be watching that stomp spot essentially until my left foot leaves the ground and heads to that spot. When I'm here, there's no more like adjusting. Like that stomp spot's going to kind of land where it's going to land, right? So this right here is where I step and look at the target. Step, look, and this is where the gun is coming up on target as quickly as possible. There's really no reason to be presented the gun earlier than this, right? If I wanted to get, if you take this concept of getting the gun up early too extreme, I mean, I could come in like this, right? But that's just going to slow my movement down, and there's no reason to be aiming from all the way over there if I can't shoot until I get there. So once the entry starts and I'm no longer worried about accelerating, pushing hard, that kind of idea, is when that stomp spot is when my vision is going to shift from the stomp spot to the target. So as I kind of come in carrying just a little bit of energy now, what's essentially going to happen is, again, and you'll notice how I'm emphasizing the idea of that last step is not aggressive. It's just I'm using it to burn off that last little bit of energy and just be nice and soft so that hopefully I can be firing just immediately as I come into position, right? Now, when you're training this, what I recommend you do, you don't have to have a box. You can just put a stick down on the ground to give yourself a specific spot to get across. And then you're also going to want to give yourself something to look at in terms of where you want that stomp spot to happen. I meant to have a cone out, that's what we usually use in classes, but I'll use this stapler. Again, use reverse planning. So figure out where you want to end up, right? Think about if you had your gun out, and then what you're essentially going to do is just step out with that left foot. That's your stomp spot. This is absolutely crucial because where this happens determines essentially what your stance is going to be like inside of the box, right? So if you think about that, my stomp spot, people get shocked by that because it's so shallow to the fault line that I want to get across. But that's the spacing. I mean, I just showed that from here, like that's all the step that I'm really getting in that kind of orientation. Why this is so important is if I stomp too early, what's going to happen is that right foot is going to land in the box too shallow. And so what's either going to happen now is I'm going to come in and be like this and not be very stable. And by the way, if I need to leave now, I'm not going to be in an explosive stance that allows me to cover ground quickly. Or what I see happening a lot is folks kind of stomp, step shallow, and then when the left foot comes in, they've got to take another step, which is kind of a stutter step, inside the shooting area while they're trying to aim and shoot, and it ends up costing them points because they're throwing shots, right? So obviously that's not ideal. So use this to start with to give yourself a visual index of where you're targeting that stomp spot. And what you're going to notice is that the cleaner you can hit that spot, the more likely you are to really hit that well. Now, a couple areas I still see folks struggling with on this, right? Number one is, even if you started over here in a wide, low stance, when you get here, you try to stand back up. There's two problems with that. Number one, if I need to leave again, now I'm drop stepping to get out of this position. Number two, as you bleed off momentum coming into this position, if you stand back up, it's actually adding momentum back into it, and you get top heavy and you kind of carry momentum through. What that kind of looks like is like this, right? It's kind of difficult to replicate exactly, but that's kind of what it looks like. You end up being top heavy and blowing through a position. The lower you can stay in there is not only going to set you up to be wide and low to leave again if you need to, but it's going to help you settle into this position quietly and just kind of coast that last spin. If you look at how low I get coming into this position and how quiet that kind of last step is coming in, the last thing I'll mention with that is that the lower you get, the deeper you can step into the shooting box. So from here, if you think about being super tall, if I stomp here and I stay tall and put that leg out, a lot of times folks end up shallow. Versus when I get low, if I get really low coming in this position, I can actually overstep the shooting box entirely if I really wanted to. That's obviously a stretch, but the point being is the lower you get, the more you have the ability to really reach out with that long side foot and make sure you land deep enough in the box that you can have a proper stance. Now, folks say, well, hey, for what I do, you know, this doesn't really apply. In IPSC, we can't leave the shooting area, right? In tactical situations, we don't have foot faults. We're not doing things based upon where our feet are. How does this apply? It actually applies the exact same way, and let me demonstrate. Okay, so we'll now imagine, I'll get rid of my box, that the camera is my target. I won't shoot you, I promise, but the camera is my target, and here's my vision barrier. Whether this is a doorway or a hallway or the end of a building or whatever it is, I've got to get past here to shoot this target. I know where it is. It's important that I shoot it quickly. I've got to get here, right? So again, if I reverse plan this, I know this is where I want to end up. So what's the best place, or the best way for me to enter this position to be ready to shoot as soon as the target is available? It's pretty obvious that me personally, I would rather enter the position like this versus entering the position like that. It's just setting you up better to be super comfortable taking that initial shot. So the process applies to vision barriers exactly the same. It's just harder now because usually you don't even have these legs on vision barriers we would use in like a match or something, or obviously in the real world. And so you've got to arbitrarily, not arbitrarily, but sort of without anything specific to look at, learn to pick a spot where I'm going to stomp and come in on that spot in order to set myself up for success. And as you begin to train this, you just want to take note of where am I landing? How is my stance? Did I way over penetrate? Am I under penetrating sometimes? You know, where am I landing? And am I landing the way that I want to for an entry on this position? So that's how I kind of look at it. The reverse planning thing, guys, is huge. It'll help you figure this stuff out because there's so many ways that we are required to enter positions. We're thinking about laterally here, but what if, as an example, I'm coming from the back and I've got to enter this box from the back? You know, which foot does it make sense to enter with first? The easiest way to figure that out is to simply get in the box, put your sights on the first target you're going to engage in the position, be like, okay, is this better or is this better? Well, obviously, because my target I'm aiming at's a little bit to the right, it opens my hips up better if I come in like this. So that's going to be kind of my first step of the entry. Gun's going to come up there. Yeah, that feels good. And now I have a plan for how I'm going to enter this position, right? A lot of high-level guys that have been doing this for decades do not necessarily plan out their entries anymore with that level of granularity. But what I found coming into the sport is that if you don't think about it this specifically, it's not going to happen on autopilot, right? And if you want to have a chance of doing it the most efficient way possible, you have to think through it. You have to plan it out. The more you do it, the more natural it'll become. Let's talk about some exits. Okay, guys, so the entry part is actually the simplest part of it because there's really one entry that I find that applies most efficiently to pretty much any kind of situation you're going to find in practical shooting. We're now going to talk about exits, and this is where I think there's a lot of variations and there's pros and cons to a lot of different ways of exiting a position. for you to think about. And we're going to talk about 6 variations of ways to get out of a position and the context behind each one. The first thing we're going to talk about is actually the drop step. So we started off talking about how if you are, tall and narrow, a lot of times it contributes to you having to sort of step opposite your direction of travel in order to get out of a position. And of course, every time you do that versus an entry where you just leave, you're costing yourself a quarter to half a second. Well, is there then any situation where it might actually be appropriate to use a drop step? And the answer is yes. So I would say basically whenever you are forced to start in some kind of a position where you don't have the leverage, right? Some kind of what we'll call a non-athletic starting position, right? So in the shooting sports, as an example, sometimes we'll have a toes on marks start position, right? Where from here, I've got to say move forward into the shooting area. Well, if I only have to take one step and there's immediately a target available, can I just step in and shoot 100%? But if I really need to launch, 3+ steps in a direction and really build up some speed, might it be more explosive for me to actually push off of that back foot after I step back? 100%, right? That's going to give me more leverage to explode forward. The better example of this, I think, is probably having to lean around vision barriers. So as an example, if I bring in, some kind of a wall and I put it towards the edge of my shooting area to where in order to see the camera, I've got to lean out here, right? Well, from this lean, I'm not able to have a foot way out here outside of the shooting area right now. And this could be because I'm using cover, right? But in this case, just because I don't want a foot fall. And so from here, if I've got to explode back in that direction, might it make sense for me from here to drop that foot outside so I have something to push off of? And to me, the answer is yes. So this is where I'm going to borrow some terminology from jiu-jitsu to kind of have 2 variations here. The first one that I just kind of showed you is what I would call the single leg, and this is the standard, the one you're going to use most often. So on a lean like this, all it is I'm going to snatch that left foot up, plant it where I have an angle, and explode off of that step. Right? Pretty basic, pretty simple, pretty easy to understand. This is one of the more athletic movements that we're going to talk about here today. So here's the biggest thing that I see people screwing up with this. This is not a jump, meaning from here you should not be doing something like that. That's not what a drop step is. I'm essentially just yanking this foot up off the ground as fast as I can and just putting it back down over there. It's just a very quick up and back down to give myself some leverage to push off of there. If you find it's too difficult for you to do that and you end up kind of doing a lurch or a jump to get that foot out, it's probably best for you to just not even do the drop step and instead just sink back down in your stance and come back across. It's probably gonna be just as fast, if not faster for you. The other variation of the drop step is what I would call a double leg drop step. And to me, this comes in handy in 2 situations. Number one, if it's an extreme lean, where I'm leaning so far that like I can't even really keep this foot on the ground type of a lean, right? Or in a situation where wherever the drop step is going to happen is really loose, like there's slippery ground and I'm just worried that if I stomp my foot down here, it's not going to stop like that, it's just going to go. This is where the double leg variation comes in handy. So the double leg is simply drop stepping with both legs at the same time. The goal being that as I lean through this position and I bring the legs across, now I'm not only stomping out wide with this kind of support leg, but I've got this foot essentially underneath me so that even if this does go, I've got some support and I don't do a total wipeout. Once again, the goal for this is not to do a jump. If you watch kind of the height of my shoulders, you're not going to see them jump up in the air as the feet come across. It's just a quick movement on the feet, and then I can explode out of position from there. So let's assume now this is not a drop step situation, and I'm actually doing a normal exit. Primarily the things to think about for here is, am I going to come out with the right foot first, or am I going to come out with the left foot first? JJ would call stepping out with the right foot a lead foot pivot. Obviously what I'm doing is taking the foot that's leading or closer to where I'm trying to go and I'm leading with that, and I'm using that as my pivot foot. It's facing downrange right now. I'm turning and I'm coming and I'm pivoting on that foot. Stepping across with the left foot would be called a crossover, right? Because you're crossing over with that trailing foot. There are pros and cons to both of these, and I think there's situations where for me they are both appropriate. The number one thing I'm going to think about is how far I'm going, right? If I'm only going 2 or 3 steps, remember the rule we just kind of looked at there with the 3-step entry is you want to be getting your gun up 2 to 3 steps before you come into that position. So if I'm only going 3 steps, then there's really no reason to bring the gun down. I may just very quickly yank, an elbow throw into it or something to get a little bit of momentum coming out of position, but I'm not going to be actually breaking off the gun and running if I'm only going 3 steps. So one of the big advantages in this case to a lead foot pivot is that I can just step out with that right foot and sort of shuffle across a very short movement without ever really coming off the gun. Versus when you do the crossover out of a position, what that's essentially doing is it's pulling your hips off the target and towards your direction of travel. Now, some folks do find that crossover is a little bit more explosive for them to get out of a position when they're doing kind of a longer full send movement. So some folks do prefer the crossover on a longer range movement, but the lead foot pivot is specifically useful for a short movement, and I'd highly recommend that you practice that as the primary exit, I think, really for USPSA specifically, because we do so many short movements like that. And the idea is, if I'm really just doing a step or 2, I'm probably going to stay on the gun entirely and just kind of step across. If I am doing 3 or 4 steps, this is where, for me, I find it very useful to work in that kind of elbow throw. If you think about, I imagine there's a dude like right here, and I'm going to try to drive my elbow through his face. Like, that's kind of the idea of the motion you're trying to do. And all that's doing is it's really just giving you some momentum to kind of explode out of position. So if I'm only going, 3 or 4 steps, it's just and getting across to that next spot. The other things to consider on lead foot pivot versus crossover are going to be A, where your final target is in the array, and also how is your weight loaded. So as an example for weight, first of all, maybe I have a little bit of a lean for whatever reason. It's not enough that I need a drop step, but it is enough that I'm loaded more on this left foot. It's obviously gonna be more difficult right now to yank this foot off of the ground and put it over there than it would be to just come off of that leg. So if my weight is loaded on a particular foot, it's worth thinking about an exit that allows me to spring off of that. Additionally, if I think about where my last target is, if my last target's over here, it's way easier to think about exiting with that crossover because that's the direction my hips are getting pulled. Versus if my last target is over here and I try to do a crossover, it's going to make it really difficult because it's pulling my hips off of that target. So think about where your targets are. How is your weight neutral? In which case, either one's going to be fine. Or is it loaded in one direction or another, which will make one of your exits more optimal. Right? So we have single leg, double leg drop step, lead foot pivot, and our crossover. Now, there's 2 variations really that we'll think about here. It's the same variation for both the lead foot pivot and the crossover, which is what is generally referred to as a leaning exit. So in other words, instead of standing here and shooting some stuff and then explosively leaving, maybe I have 3, 4 targets in this position, and I'm going to shoot, target 1, target 2, and then as I start to shoot target 3, I'm going to actually start leaving this position just as I shoot. It's not what I would call a soft exit in the sense that I'm going to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 and actually shoot while I'm moving, but I'm just starting that first step or even just starting some momentum as I shoot that last target. In the event of a shooting box like this, it's super, super applicable because I can't shoot on the move out of this particular position, but I absolutely can go bing, blah, blah, and then explode out of position as I engage that last target. Now, the rule on this is that I would only ever use a leaning exit when I'm leaving on a very aggressive target. So right now, I have a very simple array. I've got a open paper at 7, and I've got a mini popper at about 15, 20 yards, right? I probably would not want to employ a leaning exit on a difficult target like a 20-yard mini popper, because A, if I do happen to miss it, then I'm just kind of screwed, right? In other words, if I go bam and I go, oh man, now I've got to come back and make that up. So in an attempt to gain, you know, let's say a 1/4 second max by employing that leaning exit, I've now cost myself 1.5 seconds to come back and make up that shot. Totally not worth it. If it's a difficult paper target, even if I don't miss it entirely on that leaning exit, if I'm shooting Charlies and Deltas, again, the amount of time that I'm saving by doing an aggressive exit is not worth giving up alphas. So I'm only gonna really be doing a leaning exit if I'm leaving on a very aggressive target where I can guarantee my hits. That's an opportunity to leave with an aggressive exit. However, on an array, let's say I've got a mix of aggressive and more careful targets depending on target difficulty, then what I really may do is choose to shoot the array in such an order, if it doesn't cost me anything, I'll choose to shoot the array in such an order where I can leave on the aggressive target so that I can actually employ a leaning exit. It doesn't cost me anything. I'm not risking any points, but I am gaining that time now, right? So some things to think about in terms of your stage planning. That's kind of your leaning exit. Now, the rule on when to start your leaning exit, what I see a lot of people do in class is, again, imagine I'm coming now from the steel to the paper. The way folks kind of think about it is that I'm gonna go bing, steel, and then come on paper, I'm gonna go bam, bam, and I'm gonna try to start my exit sort of in the middle of this paper. I find the results on that to not be very good. First of all, your split on that paper, if it really is an aggressive kind of attack style target, is gonna be, let's say, a 20 max. So you're now just trying to leave literally 1/10 second earlier than you would if you just waited until you were done shooting. It's probably not worth it. Additionally, once I've actually landed on this target and I try to go bam and then step, that first little lurch of movement is probably the part that's going to disturb my sights the most. And so now I'm disturbing my sights right in the middle of trying to leave on that target, and folks end up shooting the target slower and not really saving any time. So what I would always recommend is to start your exit in the middle of basically your last transition, during the final transition on your array. So as I come off of the steel, as an example, to the paper, I'll be staged all the way over here against the right side of the box, and I would come off that paper, I would go bing, and now I'm leaving as I sort of exit from steel to paper. So obviously, leave to pivot is just exactly the same as normal. Bing, come off. With my crossover, same exact idea. Bing, come across. Now, in the event that you really are trying to pull off a leaning exit, but you kind of have a intermediate difficulty target, right? Where you're like, man, I'm pretty sure I can guarantee hits, but maybe, you know, I'll sling a Charlie on there or something like that. I find that I have significantly more control on a leaning crossover versus a leaning lead to pivot. The reason for that is that once I step with the right foot, I'm very committed, right? And it's movement the whole time. Versus on that crossover, I actually have the ability, if I want to kind of pause on target, I can go bing, and explode out of position. I can kind of pause in that intermediate position, like right here, pretty freaking stably for quite a while. And even if I had to throw a makeup shot or something on steel, I can kind of give myself time to do that by going bing, and I have just a lot of time right there to either make sure I land a first round impact or shoot a makeup if I absolutely had to. Now, on the crossover exit, what I find to be super important for actually gaining time here is how aggressive that first step sort of impacts the ground, is the way I like to think about it. So what I'm not going to do is go bing, bop, and then just kind of push off. What I'm going to do is actually try to think about driving this left foot into the ground as hard as I possibly can, sort of just stomping into the ground. That's really the first launch in your exit. So if you think about me going bop, bing, bah, I'm going to drive that left foot down into the ground, try to like dig a hole with that heel in the earth and really explode off of that impact. I find it to be super important. Lead to pivot is completely different because you're not actually stomping, you're just really pulling. The thing that I see people doing here is if you're trying to do a leaning lead to pivot and you don't get your momentum going, folks end up literally, when I watch them in slow motion, like shooting, and then they stick this foot out and they put it down pretty much exactly where it came off the ground from, and try to go. That doesn't actually do anything for you, right? So what you'll want to do if you're actually going to do a leaning leaf of pivot is make sure you actually get your momentum going in that direction so that you can pick the foot off and you're actually covering a significant amount of ground with that first step as you leave position, right? We'll have some slow-mo of different kinds of exits that I'm sure we're stitching in throughout here that'll hopefully help just show the exact particulars of it. But hopefully these explanations are helping you understand the why behind each kind of part that we're doing behind these different kind of exits. Now, I think when I explain a lot of this in detail, folks are like, hey, man, a lot of these movements don't really apply. You don't see these kind of movements on stages. Let me show you a couple clips here from stages where some of these movements actually save time. Okay guys, so I'm seeing how long this video is and I'm not gonna belabor the point, but I'm gonna show you a couple really quick examples. This one is gonna be what I would consider some traditional examples of how we use these techniques. We have actually a box-to-box movement, which is exactly what we kind of cover in the video or use kind of as an example, right? Now we'll notice that my last target is this no shoot right here, which means I'm not going to do a leaning exit. You can't really see here, but we just do a normal lead foot pivot. What's way more interesting is coming into the next box, right? So here we are with the stomp step. Again, folks sometimes are really, really surprised at how close that stomp step is, but what it sets you up to be able to do is take that shot just right as that foot is coasting into the box. Here it is in full speed. That was 100% run in that classifier. Here's kind of some non-traditional examples right here. This is actually a stage from the South Carolina section. I made a couple mistakes at the very end, but the movement examples here are pretty interesting, right? So we'll kind of watch it across once real quick. There's a lot going on there, a lot of back and forth. And of course, the stage designer is intended for you to go right down the middle, but we have the option to do some different things in USPSA, and I decided to take that around the back. So what we kind of see right off the bat after the draw is that we have these two little sections here, these two targets and these two targets that are available through a kind of narrow port. It is not enough space to really shoot them on the move. You kind of have to post up, and you can take both targets from one spot, but after you take the first target, you have a little bit of room to start moving on the next one. And so what we kind of did on this one is basically a leaning exit, right? So a kind of a little bit of a step on the transition to get into the exact right spot we need to be. We have basically a leaning crossover here as we come across that target, exploding into the next position. Just basically took a step back. This isn't really going to be a classic example of one of the exits that we talked about. And then we have another classic crossover, leaning crossover right here, as we're able to shoot these two targets while stepping actually out of bounds, exploding off of that first step there. And then we have a pretty good example of a three-step entry coming down here at the end, and then exiting just one of those quick lead foot pivot shuffles into that port. Not really enough time to correctly set up for a lead foot pivot. If it had worked properly, that would have been ideal. But when you only have a step or two, you can't really like see a stomp spot and like measure your gait properly to where you hit that exact spot. So you kind of have to take what you get. Anyway, some good examples there of movement actually on a stage. So I'm sure what you see in some of these is that it's not as clean as what we're showing here in terms of you're lined up exactly against, you know, a fault line and you're exiting or from shooting box to shooting box. Are there situations like that? 100% there are, right? But there's also situations where you're moving across an open spot. And the reason that I have to be right here is not because there's a box, because I have to line up against a certain port or something like that, right? And so I can, but if I look for opportunities to move aggressively on a stage, then every single time I can exit that way and I'm saving that quarter second or a half a second over somebody who's not exiting that way or not entering properly, that's gonna stack up massively by the time the stage is done. And it's time I'm gaining that doesn't cost me anything. Usually in the shooting sports, when we think about speeding up, thinking about shooting faster, and shooting faster is risking points a lot of times. None of this risks points if you do it properly. All of this is just trying to do things sooner, being more efficient, being ready, leaving sooner. None of this requires more risky shooting. And so it's just free time that we're leaving on the table and we can hopefully get back pretty easily. So guys, this was, I tried to keep this short and efficient. Folks don't like watching hour videos on the YouTubes, obviously. And it's difficult to go through this in kind of a short, condensed fashion. But hopefully that was a good breakdown of three-step entry, the main kinds of exits that we like to employ in practical shooting, and hopefully you'll find it useful in your training, and you'll find some additional performance by using some of these tools. What I do, again, if you watched it all the way through, highly recommend is that if these kind of concepts are new to you, start with the basics. Really just focus on not drop stepping out of positions, making sure that you're actually just covering ground as soon as that last shot is fired on an array. And then when you come into positions, having the gun up early, a step or two before you can actually engage a target for whatever reason, whether again it's a vision barrier, whether it's a fault line, whatever it is, a step or two before the target's available, be seeing your dot where you perceive that target to be. I highly recommend practicing this when you start. Start with a transparent vision barrier, something like this, that allows you to actually see the target through that barrier so that you can actually put your dot in the center of the A zone and just wait for it to appear. Then go on hard mode, right? Grab you some barrels and work with those, or whatever. You know, on a range, what I do a lot, especially in dry fire, what you can do is just grab a target, right? And obviously it's facing you properly, but from my perspective, this is a no shoot right now, and I'll put it up a little bit higher to where it blocks my vision, and I'll use that as a barrier that I just have to get past in order to land that first shot. So just get creative with it, but work with vision barriers, both opaque and transparent. You'll find different learning points from there. Side-to-side movement is a great, really clean way to start learning it, but do front to back, come in at angles, start downrange and run back. You know, again, I haven't talked about this in the video, but how would you figure out the best way to enter this box from downrange? Reverse planning, right? 100%. So that's how I would think about it, guys. Reverse planning, if you get one thing out of this, will help you figure this stuff out. Even if you don't memorize all the rules, it'll help you figure out how to get into these positions. So anyway, guys, hope that's helpful. Thanks so much for watching. We'll see you on the next one.